A Eucharistic procession is a perfect way for a parish to deepen its devotion to the Eucharist and bring Jesus to the world. An extension of the worship of the Mass, a Eucharistic procession is a time of walking with the Lord, just as his disciples did 2,000 years ago. And just as the disciples accompanied Jesus as he encountered peoples in towns and cities and proclaimed the good news, in a procession, we too accompany Jesus in the Eucharist as we bring him to our communities, so that people can encounter Christ on our streets and experience his presence and love. This video and corresponding guide are meant to help you plan a Eucharistic procession. Whether your parish has never planned a procession before, or you are looking for ways to expand and grow processions you already are planning, in this video we will look at the following aspects of planning and holding a Eucharistic procession. 1. Initial planning steps. 2. Planning your procession route. 3. Roles and procession order. 4. Liturgical sequence of events. And finally, 5. Evangelizing through the procession. Any Eucharistic procession is ultimately the responsibility and falls under the direction of the pastor or bishop. However, he may decide to delegate aspects of planning the procession to others. If this is the first procession your parish has organized, planning should ideally begin several months in advance. Under the pastor's leadership, a group of parish leaders should be brought together to begin planning your procession. It's often a good idea for these leaders to include people from a variety of parish groups and ministries. If a date has not yet been determined, select a date for your procession. Eucharistic processions often traditionally occur on the Solemnity of Corpus Christi, but you can certainly hold processions on other dates as well. As you are planning your procession, be sure to keep in mind your parish's history, demographics, and circumstances. The liturgical guidelines for processions leave significant room for flexibility and variation depending upon local traditions and other factors, allowing your procession to reflect the needs and customs of your community. When considering the route of your Eucharistic procession, there are a number of options you can consider. If this is your parish's first procession, you may want to keep the route short and perhaps simply process around the parish grounds. However, because it is meant to be a public witness of veneration toward the Eucharist, the procession should not remain inside the church building. If there is another Catholic church nearby, you can plan to process from one church to the other. If not, plan a route that comes back to your own church. Be sure to keep in mind the needs of those in the procession. As you plan, ask yourself, is the route accessible for people with wheelchairs or families with strollers? How long will the procession take? You may want to consider having a vehicle follow behind the procession or be on standby to provide people with a ride if needed. Along the route, you may decide to plan for 1 to 4 stations where the procession will stop for prayers and benediction. However, these stations are not a required element to hold a Eucharistic procession. If you are going to incorporate stations, they should be set up in areas that allow for the entire congregation to gather, such as outdoor shrines, parks, or even parking lots. Station altars should be arranged with an altar cloth, corporal, candles, monstrance stand if available, and other appropriate decorations such as flowers, banners, and artwork. Plan to assign individuals to be in charge of setting up the station altar or altars prior to the procession, and to go ahead of the procession to make sure everything is prepared and the candles are lit. You should consider how the route could possibly be decorated for the procession. For example, some cultures have beautiful traditions arranging carpets of flowers along the route of Eucharistic processions. If desired, you can invite parish groups to help decorate the route following the traditions of your community. If your route will take you off parish grounds, you will need to apply for and receive any proper permits and licenses from local authorities well in advance. Be aware you may need to adjust your route based on recommendations from police and town or city authorities. In a Eucharistic procession, every person has a place and a role. The celebrant who carries the Eucharist in the monstrance is central and essential, but other groups of people precede and follow him, actively participating in the worship of Christ in the Eucharist. The liturgical books offer some guidance on the order of the procession, but much is left open to variation. Let's now discuss some of the essential and optional roles in the procession. It's important to note that the order presented here is not mandated and can be adjusted based on your own parish community. The cross, held by an altar server, leads the procession. Walking just behind the cross bearer are altar servers carrying candles. It may be helpful to have a master of ceremonies walking with this lead group who can help the cross bearer set the pace so that the procession stays together. You may also have an additional altar server near the front to ring bells to indicate to the public that the procession is approaching. Often following the cross, the children who have recently received their First Communion are given a place of honor in the procession and can sprinkle flower petals before the Eucharist. The core of the procession is the celebrant holding the Eucharist in a monstrance. As he is carrying the monstrance, the celebrant is typically covered by a canopy held by 4 to 6 people. Just in front of the canopy are 1 or 2 altar servers with thuribles, incensing the Blessed Sacrament in turns. The incense symbolizes both the prayers of the people rising up to God, as well as the great beauty and mystery of the Eucharist. The celebrant wears a cope and a humeral veil, types of vestments which allow him to carry the monstrance without touching it with his hands. This is a reminder that we are not focusing on the priest. Rather, our focus is on Christ himself. The canopy, while not strictly required, adds dignity to the procession by making a sacred space for the Eucharist throughout the procession. It is reminiscent of the Israelites' journey in the wilderness, when God dwelt with them in the tent of presence, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. It's also a focal point for people to follow and know where the Eucharist is. Additional torches held by altar servers can also be used to escort the Blessed Sacrament. It's also appropriate for others in the procession to carry small candles. Depending upon the number of altar servers and clergy that you have available, there may be additional optional roles that each may be responsible for, based on local custom. If, on the other hand, you do not have enough altar servers, do your best to cover the most essential roles, but don't allow that to stop your procession. Following this core group, the liturgical texts do not describe how the faithful should arrange themselves in the procession. Lay associations and other ministries in the parish can process together and even carry a banner. It's also appropriate to process with statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary and other saints carried on biers. If there is a choir, all members should process in a group to lead the procession in hymns and prayers. If appropriate, they can use a mobile sound system or have multiple groups spread throughout the procession so that everyone can sing and pray together. Booklets should be available for the people so that they can sing as well. It's vital that everybody in the procession knows where they should be and what their role is. Those who are leading groups or carrying banners or the canopy should rehearse their parts ahead of the procession. Altar servers should also be well trained to make sure they understand their roles. Depending upon your route, you will likely be working with police on the day of the procession to keep roads blocked if needed and to keep the procession moving in the right direction. You may also want to have volunteers distributing water bottles throughout the procession or at various stations. Now let's go through the standard sequence of events for a Eucharistic procession. The procession begins after Mass, or a period of public adoration. If the procession occurs after Mass, the hosts carried in the procession should be consecrated at this Mass. After communion, the monstrance is placed on the altar, and the consecrated host is placed in the monstrance. Those who have particular roles in the procession, those carrying the canopy, banners, or biers, those leading groups of the faithful, the altar servers, and other volunteers, should arrange themselves for the beginning of the procession after they have received communion. The celebrant then says the prayer after communion, but omits the concluding rites. Then, wearing a cope, the celebrant kneels before the altar and incenses the Blessed Sacrament. Putting on the humeral veil, the celebrant goes up to the altar, genuflects, and takes the monstrance, holding it with his hands covered by the veil. The procession forms with the cross-bearer leading the Blessed Sacrament to the canopy. The faithful, leaving their pews, follow behind the celebrant and servers. As the procession forms outside, be prepared to wait as groups gather in the appropriate order. Processing along the planned route, the choir, if present, leads the faithful in songs and prayers, worshiping Christ in the Eucharist and expressing faith in the real presence of the Blessed Sacrament. If station altars have been set up, the procession stops at each altar along the route. Placing the monstrance on the altar, the celebrant kneels before the altar and leads the faithful in prayers, a reading from the Gospels, and/or a brief period of silent adoration. Then Eucharistic benediction is given before the procession continues. At the end of the procession, either back inside the church or at an appropriate location outside the church, solemn Eucharistic benediction is given. After benediction, the Blessed Sacrament is removed from the monstrance and placed in the tabernacle. It's important to remember that Eucharistic processions are meant to give a public witness of faith and devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. They are incredible opportunities to evangelize our communities and neighbors. Throughout the planning process for the procession, you should invite people to come and promote the procession, not just in your parish, but in the broader community as well. Leading up to the procession within your parish community, you should work to help parishioners better understand the Eucharist. For example, in the weeks leading up to the procession, the homilies may be focused on the Eucharist. Inserts could be included in the bulletin explaining what a procession is, or a speaker could be brought in to give a talk on the Eucharist. On the day of the procession, you will pass by people who may be intrigued by what they are witnessing. Consider training a group of street evangelists who can walk on the outer parts of the procession and be ready to have conversations with people who want to learn more about what you are doing. Be sure to invite anyone who looks interested to join the procession. Consider having cards or pamphlets made to explain the procession and invite people to Mass. At the end of the procession, consider holding a celebration or other event, perhaps with food, games, and music. The procession should help build community and be a memorable event for everyone involved. Finally, throughout the whole planning process, be sure to pray for the procession and all who will be part of it or witness it. Consider holding a holy hour at the start of the planning process, and perhaps have weekly holy hours dedicated to praying for the success of the event and for the hearts of all those who will encounter Jesus during the procession. It is our hope that your Eucharistic procession will allow people to encounter Jesus Christ in the Eucharist and give a public witness of faith to your community. May the process of planning for the procession be a period of grace for you to grow in your own devotion to the Eucharist.